There's no question that inflation and the cost of living is a big pressure point for many Americans, but one group is severely being impacted, and that's low-income workers. The shortage of low-cost units makes it more difficult for minimum wage workers to secure affordable units, especially in desirable neighborhoods or metropolitan areas. Now, here to weigh in on this issue, let's bring in Kathryn Anne Edwards, who is an economist and policy consultant here. Great to have you on this very topic. I mean, how much of a crisis are we looking at for affordable housing at this juncture?
It's hard to put it into historic terms because when you can't find housing, it's a crisis, right? If you're a family who can't find a good place to live for your children, if your wages, you work full time and you can't afford a place to live, it's a crisis for you. So it's hard to say to what extent it extends through the economy because most people find a way to make do, even if that's paying 50 to 60% of their income to housing. What we know is that the number of affordable units is falling in the US and that wages at the bottom are simply not growing to keep up with the housing market.
And when we think about this too, I mean, of course, there's always, typical New Yorker thinks about this applied to New York, right? So as I'm thinking through this, there are so many jobs, especially where people who want to be able to stay and live in New York and perhaps have even been grown and raised in New York, now are trying to figure out, okay, if I can't afford here, then how does that change the living situation so severely to the point where now I'm adding on hours of commute or I'm commuting in from some area outside of the metropolitan area. So how is this also kind of correlating with what we're seeing on the wage front right now? Because that is the bigger issue here too.
So the, housing affordability is about price relative to income. And a lot of our conversation about housing affordability has been about price, which we can move through supply. We need to build more affordable units. We need to build more high-end units. We need to build more units across the United States. And in overcrowded metro areas, we need to build more. And that should help stabilize prices. And, the inflation crisis that we have right now has lent a lot of kind of lens and spotlight on housing prices because they seem to be keeping inflation from falling at the level that we want. But the income side gets so much less attention. The minimum wage right now is $7.25 an hour. If you work every hour of the year, you can afford $377 a month in rent. There is no amount of housing supply that is going to create a $377 a month apartment in almost every single metro area in the US, including most rural areas. So the supply side requires a portfolio of options, multifamily, low income, high income, single family, low income, high income. But the income side, the wages really comes down to why we have structured our labor market to produce so many working poor people.
It's really interesting. I think about kind of my own situation. I live in an apartment where honestly, if they were charging me the real market rent, the market rate versus what they're actually kind of saying, hey, you just have to pay this, I probably wouldn't be able to live in that apartment, quite frankly, here. So, and there are a lot of people that are in that situation. Does there need to be an adjustment of market rates across the board? Because that's actually not accounting for what people are really paying and what the actual demand profile looks like.
Yes. I mean, there are so many good housing policies out there that we haven't pursued. We could do more for the low income housing tax credits. We could do more for, quality assurance in housing, helping renters at all income levels. And I think of a lot of people who feel, basically lucky to be in the place they're in, that feel like they are below market, and they, not to point fingers, but they are their own type of problem because they are taking affordable units off the market and basically sitting on them. And I think this is most often brought up with homeowners who are at, they got an interest rate in the pandemic that was below 3% on a 30-year mortgage. They don't want to move and go to a 6.5% rate somewhere else for a more expensive home. So the supply side requires more than anything, lots of movement for homes to be available, for people to be able to take advantage of the market. But the income side is a much more pernicious problem in that it doesn't have this ready option of solutions that we can immediately start to pursue. How do you get rid of the fact that the United States has one of the largest shares of low-wage workers out of any country in the industrialized world? Nobody pays people as little as we tend to pay people in the US. So yes, there's lots of ways to unlock the housing market through more supply and more movement. But how do we generate better incomes at the bottom? Housing just offers us a lens to think about kind of how our economy produces income.
And so within that as well, it might come down to where the jobs are located. If we continue to see such a concentration of corporations near or adjacent to major cities, then that's also not facilitating some of that very movement that you're talking about, I would suppose, as well.
Yes, but I mean, you want companies to make decisions, not based on housing, right? We want them to make decisions based on supply chains, based on intellectual and human capital, based on, convenience to how they do their business. We don't want housing to hinder businesses. And that means we need to have lots of movement. That means we have, the not a lot of lock in the housing market. We don't want people to be locked into homes because if they move, they'll never be able to afford another one. That requires a thriving, functioning, well-supplied housing market. And let businesses make business decisions that are best for them. The question of low wage workers and low income Americans comes down to labor policy, right? What do we think the minimum wage should be? Because it's been 7.25 since, I was in high school. What do we think labor law should look like? Should it be enforced? We are in a renaissance of child labor right now. That is a policy decision, not a business decision and not a personal decision. That's a policy decision.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah, it was something around $5 when I first started my first job, and my dad made me ask for minimum wage when I went in there. So $7 sounds quite attractive, but it's not in today's terms, to your point, at all, and not sustainable. Just lastly, while we have you here, when you think about the number of people that are looking for housing, maybe renting, maybe looking to own even one day, I was looking at the stat from Redfin that buyers need to earn $114,000 to afford the typical U.S. home. That's 35% more than the typical household makes here. I mean, these are improvements, but it's still not nearly where the dial needs to be at or the correlation needs to be at in order for households to feel like they're not falling behind here as well at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing that up because I think, when we focus on things like inflation in financial markets, we're looking for that short-term measure of gain, right? Once rents go down enough that CPI falls with it, then we get the interest rate cut and we get to declare victory. But most U.S. households cannot declare victory over the amount of money they are spending either on their rent or on their mortgage, even after CPI moves enough for us to feel like we've won over inflation. So I think it's critical to bring up this idea of affordability for Americans and just this fundamental disconnect between how much people earn and how much housing costs. That will not go away even when we get a good CPI print. And I think while we have this attention on housing affordability, coming from this big national question on inflation, this is the time to think creatively and it's time for policymakers to act. What I try to bring up is that there are probably 20 pieces of legislation in Congress right now of ways to increase housing supply, increase housing affordability, and get movement in the housing market. There are almost no policies of how to generate income and better labor law at the bottom.
Wow, that's really important to point out here. Kathryn Anne Edwards, Bloomberg economist and policy consultant here. Thank you so much for taking the time here with us today. Really appreciate it. Important conversation.
Thank you for having me.